Well, thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for your attendance. Thank you specifically, Dr. Neely, for organizing this event and for taking over really where Dr. Richard Miller, who used to champion these colloquia, left off. He was very enthusiastic about them, saw the value as a learning opportunity, and encouraged us to participate. And it's very encouraging that where the Juniors Institute took it over for a year or two, we now find many of these colloquia held right here at Puritan Seminary. And I think Dr. Neely is one that we have to thank for that, and I wish to do so. I do apologize for arriving slightly late, and I have to make another apology, and that is that I will divide the lecture slightly differently from what I said. The reason for that is I got a cold, and I, at some moment yesterday, thought I was not going to be able to speak at all. But my voice, by God's grace, recovered, and I don't know how long it will hold. So I changed my material slightly, because what I will present to you, I can easily just stop where it is, and it will still make sense. What I was going to present to you, it would not have made so much sense. So it's still broadly related to Guideo de Bres, religious liberty, and so on. But I changed the material somewhat. In a way, it's more interesting material. It's certainly, I don't think you can find this anywhere else. I don't think anybody else has written quite on this. I would be shocked to learn that somebody has. But I think you'll agree that it's certainly relevant for what we want to know about Guideo de Bres, the Belgic confession, and issues of religious liberty, which certainly I think confront all of us. Also in historical theology, there's a lot of historical theology work being done. You know, Emilio Campi, for example, about the relation and the thought of the reformers on Islam, for example. You know, it's a hot topic, and he's uncovering many surprising things. It's not all what you would expect. But certainly on many fronts, Christians are forced to think and to consider these issues, talk about them, think about them. And part of it has to do with, you know, the situation we face in the West. Many states are becoming more irritated, it seems, with Christians. And some of them just see us as fundamentalists and kind of equivalent to Islam. And part of it has to do with what do we do when we do have the power. Right? What do we do in societies where Christians are asked to give a biblical view or a biblical perspective? How do you handle power biblically, responsibly? And that's, of course, where Article 36 of the Belgic Confession is so important. But my topic today is, and the title, how I limited it, you'll see at the top of the handout, Pressure to Confessionalize. A reason for de Bres' political restriction of religion, also in the confession, with a question mark. So this has to do with, as you can see, de Bres' political restriction of religion. We can say political compulsion of religion. Is that also in the confession? And why? Now, what I'll do, I don't know if we have people that expect this to be only 20 minutes or half an hour. I can split it in halfway. We'll see how it goes. I will certainly see how my voice holds. At the moment, it's feeling well. But what I'll do, I'll start, and perhaps it will be good to take a break kind of halfway and ask a few questions, and then see how long we want to go after that. These are exciting days for de Bres scholarship. Digital research techniques and the labors of Wim Moon at the Protestant University in Amsterdam have uncovered many sources used by Guideo de Bres for his largest and possibly his most important theological treatise, Le Bâton de la foi chrétien, the weapon of Christian faith. And this is allowing scholars to begin to trace de Bres' thought to influences and sources in ways that could not previously be done. And many of these sources were long suspected and are no surprises, but there also are some surprises. For example, de Bres' use of writings by Thomas Cranmer that was available to him, it seems, in French. Bres also made extensive use of Pierre Viret. One thing is already becoming clear. Bres was influenced by far more than Calvin, who was the one whose shadow was traditionally thought to loom large over all of Bres' work. So that's one exciting development. Another exciting development is that there have been a number of remarkable studies on Bres recently, among which I should name Klaas van der Swaag's Onverkort of Gekortweg. Did I bring the book? Oh, yeah. This is such a fascinating book. This man writes swiftly. He's a journalist, so his whole style of writing, it's on Article 36 and the change of Article 36 of the Belgic Confession in 1905. But he gives the whole historical context. It is, if you can read Dutch, it is a must-have, absolute must-have. And this book is also a standard book to have, the Belgic Confession by Nick Grootjes. So a number of excellent resources coming out. I should also mention the volume edited by Erik de Boer and Emile Breekman, Guido de Bres, zijn leven, zijn belijden. And if there's one thing that these studies have shown us, it is the remarkable stability and the consistency of his theological thought. He could steer a straight course through all these troubled times. And he was able to wind the golden thread of unity and truth of God's revelation through many aspects of theology. Now, these two developments present us with two big questions. The one is this. Many scholars have long agreed that Bres' theological work generally embraces moderate political compulsion of religion. The civil ruler should apply the first table of the law, for example, and he should punish false religion and heretics, although not necessarily by death and certainly not cruelly. Once again, van der Swaag gives, in my opinion, a very balanced view of the historical context of all that. But at the same time, many strongly argue that Article 36 of the Belgic Confession have somehow remained exempt from this feature of Bres' thought. So we find scholars like, for example, Cornelis Vonk, and more recently Daniel Miller in his treatise, or his dissertation, saying that yes, it affected all of Bres' thought, his advocacy of a degree of religious compulsion of religion. But it did not affect Article 36 of the Belgian Confession. But if Bres was as measuredly consistent as many show, is it really plausible that his most famous work, the Belgic Confession, escaped this preference for a moderate political compulsion of religion? Perhaps the scholars who see Bres' advocacy of the political restriction of religious liberty as extending also to Article 36 of the Belgic Confession have been right after all. So that's the one question that it brings to us. And the second question it presents us with is this. If Bres, despite living in hiding and being constantly on the run for so many years, could engage, as Wim Moon is showing us, with thinkers throughout Europe. He could obtain these books. He was in hiding, serving the church under the cross, the underground church. But he somehow obtained these books from the farthest places, and he interacted with them intellectually, corresponded very often with some of these theologians, and he was so well connected. Well, if this is true, and if Calvin's influence upon Bres, although real enough, was therefore more relative than previously thought, whence comes Bres' advocacy of the political restriction of religious liberty? Right? If it's not the easy answer, Calvin. And we all know what Calvin did to Michael Servetus and how he responded to Castellio. That was the stock answer, right? So it was an easy way to say continuity with Calvin explains Bres. And how he responded to Castellio, I said, but it is making less sense nowadays to simply attribute Bres' ideas to so-called continuity with Calvin or some such notion. The wider network of influence now also confronts us with several discontinuities between Bres and the Genevan Reformer, or the Genevan Reformers. After all, unlike Calvin, Beza, Bullinger, and Butzer, who were magisterially entrenched, the Bres church, the Reformed churches in the southern Netherlands, were persecuted and were politically powerless. Why should he follow Calvin, Beza, and Bullinger's example instead of, say, Pierre Viret, which was certainly more towards the position of Castellio on the spectrum, or Johannes Brentses, the Lutheran theologian, people whose influence Wim Moon has also traced to Guideo de Bres. What could the Reformed in the southern Netherlands possibly gain by favouring restriction of religious liberty? It certainly seems counterintuitive for de Bres or any other Dutch Reformed church leader to favour religious compulsion. As Andrew Pettigrew notes, in the 16th century, toleration was a loser's creed. But here, these losers, by historical and social standards of the 16th century, did not embrace toleration. So why did de Bres favour political restriction of religion? My suggestion today is that these two questions, the one about whether we should think of the Belgic Confession as also exhibiting de Bres' thinking about political religious restriction, and why it made sense for de Bres to favour the political compulsion of religion at all, can perhaps profitably, and perhaps should, be considered together. They may, in fact, be two sides of the same coin. And my name for this coin would be pressure for confessionalization. Now, that's a big debate in Reformation scholarship, and the interpretation of it is also disputed. So I will take the easy way out and just not define it. But I will say, during the course of the lecture, a few things about confessionalization and how that helps us as a lens to look at what was going on in the 16th century and to ask these two questions. Why did de Bres favour political compulsion of religion at all? And secondly, are we to suspect and are we to expect signs of that in the Belgic Confession? Now, the story of how de Bres' position on the religious compulsion and the confession has to be related is simply this. This is my thesis that I'll present to you today. That the desperate plight of the Reformed in the southern Netherlands made de Bres and the Reformed church leaders eager to work out a modus vivendi with the magistrates and the lesser nobles. The churches needed political patrons to take them under their wing and to protect them from the consuming fury of King Philip II. The Reformed churches could also, from their side, bring something to the table that the lesser nobles needed. The church offered social discipline of an increasingly restless and potentially revolutionary population. And that's one key word when you talk about confessionalization as a way of thinking about the interpretation of the Reformation, is from the government's side, and from the theory goes, it's still a theory and some are disputing it, but from the rulers' side, they wanted a measure of social control. They wanted a disciplined social body. They didn't want revolutionaries. And according to the theory then, and it has been demonstrated to work quite nicely in the empire, in the German territories, especially towards the late 16th century. So it works well in the Lutheran countries. It doesn't work quite so well in the theory in France, for example, and elsewhere where it's been tested. Philip Benedict says it does. He wants to hold to a weaker, he calls it a weaker theory of confessionalization. And he tests it, looks at some places in France, and he says it works. But you have to hold to a weaker. So the idea is that it's not only from the top, as the original theory holds. The kings, the rulers would kind of want this social discipline, and therefore they encouraged confessionalization because this defined an identity, and this allowed them to then implement this social discipline. And then through the process of schools and churches and creeds, there would be kind of a body, a political body that kind of thinks alike. That's the theory. Now, the weakness of the theory initially was that it emphasized very much that it came from the top, like in Lutheran countries. And you don't find the same dynamic in Calvinist countries. But like Philip Benedict is arguing, if you see it from the top and from the bottom, then you have something. Then it's very useful, and it can function as a very useful way of looking at a dynamic sometimes similar to what we're finding in the Netherlands in the 16th century. So de Bres and the Reformed were eager to work out a modus vivendi, and the Reformed churches themselves could also bring something to the table. They offered social discipline of an increasingly restless and potentially revolutionary population. Now, some of these claims I'll substantiate when we discuss it today. And feel free to ask me if there are things that I've claimed that seem to be left hanging in the air. The Reformed also held out to the magistrates the promise of greater magisterial independence and even wealth, if only they would move against the Catholic Church. In any event, if God gave rulers the duty to act against idolatry, and if Catholicism was idolatry, well, then the rulers didn't really have the option to refuse if they desired God to bless them and their lands. What the Reformed were willing to sacrifice to achieve this was to accept a degree of civil political interference in religion. Certainly, this was one way to prod the nobles in the Netherlands to get involved, to step in, instead of just standing back, to become involved by saying, well, God expects you to root out idolatry. That is your God-given duty. And if you want God to bless you as a ruler, if you want God to bless you as a political community, you have to do what King Hezekiah did, King Josiah did, and you have to abolish idolatry, which means you have to step in and defend the true believers, the Reformed faith, against the idolatrous ambitions of the king. Now, in a dynamic like this, confessions were crucial. Wolfgang Reinhardt, the father of the confessionalization theory, points out. A confession marks and forms identity and functions as a charter or even a roadmap for a deal of or partnership between church leaders and civil rulers. So what I shall try to show is that there's real evidence that something like this was going on. And I shall do so in a few steps. First, I shall say something about the interpretation of Article 36 of the Belgic Confession, just to remind you that the idea that there is political restriction of religion going on in this article has long been a serious option. And second, I shall quickly paint the historical context to show you that there was a flurry of Reformed church political involvement in this time that makes this kind of political, religious, and confessional dealing convincing. And third, I shall give you a few pieces of evidence from the Belgic Confession and its related documents that support this kind of argument. And fourthly, I shall briefly show you how seriously this project of obtaining a sponsor or patron was for de Bres by citing his 1565 letter to the consistory of Antwerp. So first, a few comments about the interpretation of Article 36. You can see on your handout I have an extract there for you. And I quote it from the 1793 edition. And the reason is that in most of our modern translations today, we have softened the original language of the confession, especially concerning the office of the magistrate, concerning idolatry and false worship. And the danger is that this may obscure what is really, to a certain extent, in the text. And that is far from over in the scholarly discussion about de Bres' intention. So there are still many serious scholars who hold that de Bres took a very high theocratic view in Article 36 and expects the government, or gives the government a direct task of abolishing idolatry. Cornelis van Dam is one of them. So if we read the 1793 paragraph from the Article 36, and their office is not only to have regard unto and watch for the welfare of the civil state, but also to protect the Holy Church service, and to prevent and extirpate all idolatry and false worship, to destroy the kingdom of Antichrist, to promote the kingdom of Jesus Christ, and to take care that the word of the gospel be preached everywhere, that God may be honored and worshipped by everyone as he commands in his word. This was fairly much how Reformed churches generally understood the article until the second half of the 19th century, as witnessed, for example, by the Act of Synod of the Christelijk Afgescheidene Gereformeerde Kerk of 1857. And the big change was in 1905, the Synod of Utrecht. So that just to show that it's certainly not at all far-fetched to think of a direct duty for the government given in Article 36. It's very much still part of our scholarly conversation. Secondly, I said I would give a historical context that confirms that there was a pressure to confessionalize. So let's look briefly at the historical context. When the historian Bakhuizen van den Brink describes the Belgic Confession as a thoroughly political document, he had good contextual reasons for saying so. The ruthless persecutions of Philip II and his cohort of fervent ecclesiastical advisors threatened to kill the Reformation in the Netherlands before it was properly born. There are indications that the Reformed church leaders were realizing that they were either going to have thoroughly magisterial Reformation in the Netherlands or none at all. We read in the records of the Synod of Antwerp in 1566 that they ordered a confession made, one assumes in addition to the Belgic Confession, or perhaps a simplification of the Belgic Confession, consisting mainly of scripture references, specifically for the purpose of negotiating with the Dutch nobles. The young Franciscus Junius was tasked with this. It was also Junius who took the Belgic Confession, revised by the 1566 Antwerp Synod, to Geneva for their approval, once again showing a magisterial connection. There is some evidence that the Belgic Confession was submitted to the Diet of Augsburg in 1566, although Nicholas Grootjes considers this improbable. Guideo de Bres himself was in contact and negotiation with various rulers and nobles. He became the court preacher to the Duke of Bouillon in Sedan in 1562. In 1564, he was sent to Brussels and later to Metz on diplomatic missions, meeting also the Prince William of Orange and Louis, his brother. He also played a role at the Conference of Nobles at Saint-Tron in 1566. So there was intense political activity by the Reformed church leaders, probably simply because it was becoming a matter of survival. Now, allow me to show you two pictures that I've brought along for you that shows the general frustration of the Dutch population with the lack. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, here's more if you need. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Well, there's that's more than enough. It should be. Now, these are more or less contemporary drawings, slightly later. The first one shows een slapende leeuw, a sleeping lion. That is the magistrates who are sleeping, while wolves and foxes are wreaking havoc, eating the common prosperity, het gemene welvaart. You'll see a dog slaughtering some geese. You'll see the wolf die gaapt, and the wolf gaping, the vos die steelt, the fox stealing the geese, dog barking, a mule collapsing under the load of taxation and so on. Trade and prosperity is leaving the country. That's depicted by the shepherd and his flock fleeing. And the important thing is that the Nederlandse Macht, the Dutch nobles, the political powers, are asleep while all of this is going on. And if you turn the page, you'll find a depiction, once again, shortly, really after the period we considered now, with the early 1560s. This is probably 1567. It shows the Duke of Alba, so this would be 1567, 1568, and it is dated 1567. But this picture, like the one following it, are very similar. And I reproduced two of them to show you how deeply ingrained this kind of frustration was. So what's going on, you have the Duke of Alba. He was appointed by the King of Spain, holding the provinces of the Netherlands in bondage. They are the maidens kneeling there and very much humiliated and in bondage. Blowing into his ear is the Cardinal Antoine Gravel, van Gravel, and he is blowing with a kind of a blow into the ear and inspiring, obviously, with wicked doctrine, this ruler. And behind him stands the devil, holding out crowns, both an earthly crown and a papal tiara. And in the back you'll see various scenes of slaughter, people being broken on the wheel and on the rack, people being hanged and burned. These were terrible times for believers in the southern Netherlands. And two nobles are depicted as being decapitated, that is Egmont and Hoorn. But the really important thing is, well, before I get to that, one very interesting thing is you'll see that there's somebody with a scoop, scooping out from this pool of blood money. And that is the Roman Catholic Church, who in this depiction is benefiting financially from all this chaos and persecution. But the really important thing is, in the right-hand corner, standing there, are the civil magistrates. Not helping, not interfering. They are standing like statues. On the next picture you can see that even clearer. And with their hands on their lips. So they are immobile, they are inactive, and they are not coming to the rescue of the suffering people. If you page over, you'll see the next picture is also from about 1567 or 1568. It is dated 1569. This kind of design survived in artwork for 100 years after. It had such a big impression, so it was very successful, and obviously something spoke to the situation. But notice in the second design, once again, the nobles standing immobile and inactive. So I think when we look at this whole situation, we realize the predicament of the Reformed in trying to get the nobles to become active, to step in. Now, how do you get people to step in and to protect believers from a ruthless king who has all the power, he's centralizing power, the growth of the absolute state, and there's a lack of involvement, and there's a lack of stepping in. Perhaps this would be a good time to take a break in a minute or two. Let me just see where I am with my presentation, if this is a good moment. Yeah, well, I was going to look at some indications in the Belgic Confession and two related texts, and then so I think for the sake of my voice, perhaps if we can take 5 or so minutes now, 10 minutes, let's say 10 minutes. Is that okay? Will that work? And if there are any questions, or perhaps somebody else can share, and I can just grab a glass of water and hope my voice holds a little longer. Is this clear how the political pressure, let me ask this, how the political pressure and the desperation of the believers in the Netherlands is creating a situation, oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Is creating a situation where the believers are desperate to work something out. They need somebody, they need a patron, they need a sponsor to take them under the wing. And I think the evidence there is very clear. But I don't know if there are any questions about this.
So, Antoine, if you fast forward that to the Senate door, when you had really the church kind of really playing to the political powers, right? Trying to, with Maurice and the whole environment development stuff. trying to, you're before that now, aren't you?
Yeah, this is well before that. Now we're talking 1560s, 1550s even. So I'm looking at the period 1550s, and the confession was written in 1561 and then adopted in 1563, 65, and 1567. So it's well before that. Yeah, and it's a totally different situation because the ruler is the king of the Habsburg Empire, King Philip II. He has his half-sister, the Duchess of Parma, who's the governess of the Netherlands, and they are appointing as very much a tightly controlled group of people loyal to the hierarchy of the king. And to get these nobles, and this was a challenge. How do you somehow prod them into taking up the sword, stepping in? That seems to be a great problem, and there were fears from their side because there was social trouble brewing. We'll look at a text of that in a moment. And so some of the nobles were saying, well, you are a bunch of Anabaptists. This is going to be a revolution. You want me to stand up against my king? I mean, that's unheard of. To stand up against the king and to stand up against the Roman Catholic Church, these were huge demands. Yeah, but it's well before the Synod of Dort, yeah. Of course, the Reformed were very much in power, although still the minority. They were certainly in power more. Dr. Beeke.
Does Klaus Venslak deal with all these tensions at length in his massive tome, or does he focus more on other things related to this?
He deals with it at length.
He does.
Yeah, but he is focused on a lot.
What?
He's focused on a lot. He covers a lot in that book of his. He even covers kind of the present political situation and the various Dutch political parties, and the idea of Article 36 as a theocratic ideal.
So does he write his book for scholars, but then also he's wanting to reach lay people so that they can think through these issues themselves today?
I think his book was perhaps written as his dissertation that was just slightly reworked.
Okay.
But it's very legible, I think. I'm not sure if it's, if it would serve as an academic text for a class or something. It well may. Certainly certain chapters would. Yes, Greg.
Just a quick clarifying question. So who in their mind do they see the king as sort of protecting or upholding or unwilling, or obviously they see persecution, but whenever you have the sort of patronage towards one person or one group, inevitably results in patronage is almost in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
In some sense. So who do they see as being the sort of entity that the king is protecting?
Well, that's a good question. I think there are so many sentiments that you find traces of. One was that it's a Spanish thing, right? So it's a nationalistic flavor that it gets. Here is the king, and he's a Spaniard, and he gets many of his appointments are Spaniards too. So it has an ethnic flavor, or at least a national flavor sometimes. But certainly there's the Roman Catholic connection, and he is protecting Roman Catholic. Or that is the suspicion. There's not so much a suspicion that perhaps he's really ruthless. Perhaps he's just using this religious disunity for his own advantage, to further his own political position. There's not much recognition of that. And modern scholars are pointing to that and saying Bres and many others were naive. They should have known that more of that was going on. But I'm not exactly sure. That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure who they would say. From biographical accounts of Philip II, he was a very devout Roman Catholic. His father, Charles, stepped down as emperor, and I think he entered a monastery or something. Did he become a monk? He abdicated, which was also strange for those years. And I think he spent the rest of his life in a monastery. Dr. Neely.
Also, question of clarification. At this point of your the discussion or the argument that you set forth, where do you differ with current scholarship? Or do you agree with Moons and the Boer and Van der Zwaan and others? Or where do you differ at
Okay.
this moment?
Okay. Well, see, they wouldn't all be on the same page. You know, there are many interpretations of Article 36. I haven't really laid out much with regards to, that is controversial with regards to the political situation. I think everybody would basically, these are kind of commonly recognized facts. I wanted to give that as a background because it makes more plausible that Bres was, to use a cynical term, playing this game, or perhaps I should say following this strategy, like many of the Dutch Reformed Church leaders were. They made sure in their writings that they could take this to the Dutch nobles and this would make good political sense. Yeah. Okay. Well, shall we continue? Let's then look at some indications in the Belgic Confession and two from texts accompanying the confession that comport with the idea that the Reformation church leaders were aiming for an arrangement with the magistrates, for which, as we have mentioned, a confession would be central. The first three of these are from Article 36. Now I'll go through these quickly because everybody here knows Article 36 well. Number one, look at how increased power is held out to the magistrates when we read the opening lines of the Confession's Article 36. We believe that our gracious God, because of the depravity of mankind, has appointed kings, princes, and magistrates, willing that the world should be governed by certain laws and policies. Now, if you said this early in the 16th century, many people would ask, well, are you not forgetting something? You're saying God gave power to the kings directly? What about the Pope? Doesn't he have a role here? The Bible tells us, after all, that the disciples had two swords, and Jesus said, 2 swords are enough. Peter carried one of these swords. So the Pope, the successor of Peter, is invested with, ultimately, governing the world according to the 2 swords doctrine. But Guideo de Bres doesn't even mention the Roman Church. So we shall return to this issue of the 2 swords a little later when I discuss what de Bres writes on that. So that's one little glimpse in the Article 36. Number 2, also Article 36, near at the end, we read, moreover, it is the bounden duty of everyone, of what state, quality, or condition soever he may be, to subject himself to the magistrates, to pay tribute, to show due honor, and to respect them, and to obey them in all things that are not repugnant to the word of God. Now, in the 16th century, this too would be radical. It is telling the magistrates, you know what? Even all the priests and all the special orders and all the various ecclesiastical properties and incomes, all the networks of benefices and exceptions, all have to start paying tax. Now this must have struck a sympathetic chord, of course, because public coffers were increasingly strained, and we know that there was in the southern Netherlands and in the Netherlands widely resentment of the clerical exemptions. And the Catholic Church was at this time still the richest institution in the world. Such sentences were an encouragement to the magistrate to move against the privileges of the clergy. We read it today and we think, oh yeah, everybody should pay tax. Back then it was not by all means to be taken for granted. Number 3, also from Article 36. We read, we detest the error of Anabaptists and other seditious people, and in general all those who reject the higher powers and magistrates and would subvert justice, introduce a community of goods and confound that decency and good order which God has established among them. Now, the explicit mention of Anabaptists was added by the 1566 Synod, but this makes little difference. What this article does make clear is what the Reformed were offering is social discipline. This was the big thing the magistrates wanted and what the Reformed could offer. Hierarchy will be maintained. The magistrates who come forward and stretch out their hand to protect the reformed will be more secure than ever in their office. Guideo de Bres writes in his 1565 book, La Racine, The Root of Anabaptists, that the Anabaptists, quote, know that they have no greater enemy than us. Why was de Bres so sharp against the Anabaptists? For one thing, they deprecated the political office. And this gave them, of course, a stench among the politicians who wanted to make sure of their own political future, above all, and their own political survival. But if there was one thing that de Bres resented, it was this way in which Anabaptism threatened to jeopardize the project of a magisterial reformation in the Netherlands. So these three features of Article 36 show us that there are some features in the article, in the confession, that seem to support reading the confession as kind of a constitution for confessionalization, a confessionalization agreement with government. Now let's look at a fourth piece of evidence. It shows us exactly the same thing as number 3 that we saw in Article 36, this time from the handwritten letter that Guideo de Bres addressed to the Commissioner of Tournai, or the governess of the Netherlands. Remember how he threw a parcel over the castle wall of Tournai on 2nd and the 1st of November, evening of the 1st, morning of the 2nd November 1561. And that contained the confession that had a letter printed to the king, and then the confession proper, and then an appeal to the magistrates. Those 3 documents was printed. It was a printed edition. And it had been in circulation for some months already by the time he threw this parcel over. But there was also a handwritten letter in his own handwriting, which allowed the police afterwards to match it to his correspondence. And that is lost. We don't have that. We have a few excerpts from that, which the commissioners made and sent to the Duchess of Parma, and they sent to the king. So you can find this on the handout. Let me see if I can. This is on number 7, page number 3 of your handout. I'll start reading. If greater gentleness is not used against the people, and if they are not left in peace without compelling them to idolatry, we fear that a terrible commotion will come to all the cities of this kingdom, because we can hardly hold the people under the discipline of patience any longer. You notice those words that are so echoing of this whole idea of social discipline. We can hardly hold the people under the discipline of patience any longer, so that they do not rise up, seeing that you do not cease daily to drag good people into your prisons. We greatly fear that a terrible evil is coming, and that many who are rejoicing about present developments will come to cry for it. Do not put your trust in soldiers or similar things, but keep in mind that many who now show a friendly face and are relying for their income on your money will turn their backs on you when you really need them. We do not say this to terrify or intimidate anyone, but only because we want to encourage you to incline your hearts to peace for your own good and for the benefit of our King. For God is our witness how much we fear the uprisings of the people. For this reason, we admonish them to have patience and to pray God for all the persecutors, while they expect help from on high, which we are promised, and to leave vengeance to him to whom it belongs, that is, to God. And he will repay it on the head of all those who persecute us. And we want you to know, sirs, that had it not been for the diligence that we have practiced to admonish the people, to keep them under control, the country would by now have been absolutely devastated. Therefore, show pity unto the poor people, that you have been instructed to guard. There's again, God has instructed you to guard them, you see, and to defend against their oppressors and repel all those accusers who try to plunge you into the blood of the people of God. So this fascinating letter certainly conveys the message that there's but a thin line, not a thin blue line of policemen, but a thin line of pastors between the magistrates and a revolution. So can you see how what the Reformed Church brings to the table is the promise of social discipline? You should legitimize us, protect us, and to quote de Bres, defend us against our oppressors, unquote. And he reminds them, as you have been instructed by God, to convince them to step in, to agree, come to some kind of an agreement with the Reformed. And in all of this, the confession will serve a central purpose. And the fifth piece of evidence that Bres and the other leaders were aiming a confessional group to reach an arrangement with the magistrates is from the so-called appeal to the magistrates. I also have an extract from that, I think. Yeah, that would be number 8. That was published in 1561 and 1562, together with the Belgic Confession, like I mentioned. It was physically in the same book, bound together. First you had the letter to the king, then the confession, then the appeal to the magistrates. And I'm emphasizing this because it was intended to form part of how the confession functions. See, it was intended to be part of the confession and to reach the audience to whom the confession was addressed. In the appeal to the magistrates, Bres explicitly approves of the political limitation of religious liberty in a remarkable number of sentences, which reject the medieval and ancient notions of a two swords jurisdictional division. Bres starts by summarizing what he describes as the teaching of most of the old teachers, the doctors anciens. Now, I'll have I think this is quoted, number 8. Yeah, you can read here from number 8. Most of the old teachers of the church thought that it was not permitted for the magistrate to touch the conscience of a man by forcing and constraining him to believe. For the material sword is given in the magistrate's hand to punish thieves, robbers, killers, and others who upset this human polity. But as to religion and what pertains to the soul, only the spiritual sword of the Word of God should and can effectively set it right. This is still the old teachers' view. By distinguishing between false zeal and that religion which nobody can maintain together with notions of sedition and disturbances of the civil polity. So the majority of old teachers, Bres is saying, denied the magistrate who wields the material sword the right to punish heresy. According to these old doctors, the magistrate's jurisdiction did not extend to matters of belief and conscience. Rather, only the spiritual sword could and should identify and adjudicate such matters. What is remarkable about Bres' summary of the old views to jurisdictions is the terms he uses. There is the material sword and a, quote, spiritual sword, terms that echo the ancient doctrine of Pope Gelasius, or even the medieval doctrine of the two swords, as Gelasius' doctrine had been developed by 1300. The terms material and spiritual sword more commonly refer to ancient versions of Galatian theory. Terms like the temporal and ecclesiastical swords or powers, or regnum and sacerdotium, are later. But what does he mean exactly by his reference to a material and a spiritual sword? Well, he himself spells it out. The spiritual sword is associated with the Word of God, and this has, according to the old theory, jurisdiction in spiritual matters like heresy, belief, and conscience, whereas the material sword, or the magistrate, does not have jurisdiction over them, because, according to the old theory, his power is confined to material matters, such as crimes against property and human life. But Bres explicitly rejects the two swords division of responsibility. Quote, but we are satisfied not to follow them in this respect, and not to believe these good doctors. That is, Bres rejects an ecclesiastical jurisdiction in legal cases relating to what he calls, quote, religion and what pertains to the soul, unquote. That excludes or limits the civil jurisdiction of the magistrate. Excuse me. What Bres promotes, instead of the two swords division, is a more direct and more active role by the civil government in religious matters. And I cannot help but thinking whether what Moon is uncovering about the connection with Thomas Cranmer doesn't somehow affect this, you know. There's just a more of a Lutheran quality sometimes, or certainly a more Cranmer quality about some of the things that Bres writes. So the civil government should have a more direct, more active role in religious matters. The magistrate should himself determine who heretics are instead of ceding jurisdiction to the spiritual sword, presumably the ecclesiastical hierarchy. For this reason, the magistrate needs to know what Scripture teaches, and he gives a quotation there. We confess, he says, that the magistrate should be knowledgeable about heretics, which, we acknowledge, are disturbances in a commonwealth, in order that under this pretext innocence be not condemned by the mere accusation of its enemies, without being heard and understood. But the magistrate should think upon what the sage said. He that justifies the wicked and that condemns the just, they both are an abomination to the Lord. Proverbs 17. Good afternoon, Jonathan. Therefore, it is necessary that the judge himself be acquainted with and certain about injustice and heresy, convinced by the word of God before extending his arm to strike the accused. So, for Jonathan's benefit, let me just repeat this very important sentence, most instructive sentence about the two swords, the early medieval two swords doctrine. De Bres explicitly rejects the two swords division of responsibility. He says, but we are satisfied not to follow them in this regard and not to believe these good doctors. So according to De Bres' emphatic statement, he writes here, we confess that the magistrate should be knowledgeable about heresies and so on. The same words that introduce some articles of the Belgic Confession. The involvement of the civil government in matters of religious doctrine and worship, at least as far as the alleged crime of heresy is concerned, should be more direct than most theologians have traditionally accepted. Notice too the intimation by De Bres that, quote, heresies are disturbances in a commonwealth. Clearly De Bres accepted the common opinion of the day that without orthodoxy in religion, there can be no political stability. What is clear from Appeal to the Magistrates, by the way, note the title, is that De Bres was deliberately hoping to exchange the medieval power-sharing arrangement between the Catholic Church and the civil ruler for a secular monopoly or jurisdiction, but clearly trusting the magistrate that he would be open to reformed doctrine and teaching. And lastly, I said I would show to you how important this whole project of obtaining magisterial support was to De Bres. Something that gives us an idea of how important this was De Bres' letter to the consistory of Capernaum, as Antwerp was called. They used all these secretive names, to cover their steps the whole time, to shake off the secret agents. It's all very much cloak and dagger stuff in the 16th century. It's fascinating to read. So in his letter, De Bres reports on how he has met with Jean Taffin and Pierre van Keulen, and they were looking at the possibility of bridging differences with the Lutherans on the subject of the Lord's Supper in order to facilitate confessional unity. Once again, confessional unity is so important. And the document they were starting to consider as a possibility was the Wittenberg Concord. And here is one paragraph from the letter. You have it also in your handout. Okay, I can give you one. There you go. Sure. This would be number 9 on page 4. Number 9. Here's one paragraph from De Bres' letter. My Lord, he was now serving, remember, as the chapel preacher of Duke Henry Robert de la Marck. That's a spelling mistake maybe in your... No, it's okay. He was serving as the court preacher of Duke Henry Robert de la Marck, the governor of Normandy. So he says, my Lord instructed me to write to you so that you will urgently consider the matter, because we would want to agree with the Germans in one single confession of the main matters in order to break entirely the power of the Pope. For if we are all united in doctrine, no one would be able to touch us without offending at the same time all of Germany, which would be good beyond measure for us, And it will also serve to shut the mouths of those who say that we are not one. And by this means, our poor country will be greatly comforted. When they ask what system, what reformation of doctrine we want to bring about, the they most likely refers to magistrates. It would then be easy to respond to them. It is true that this Concordia sounds a little harsh when one first reads it, but one can understand it on the whole positively if one really wants to. And you can see he's just really stretching himself to say, you know, can't we somehow agree with the Lutherans? And how do you define a Lutheran? Well, it's somebody that holds to a Lutheran confession. And that way, a lot of the protection of the Lutherans, at least in Germany, would also apply to us. See, so he's really stretching himself, you know, can we perhaps, and then he looks at it and he really says basically, oh, you know, perhaps we can try and make something of this. He then kind of discusses some aspects of the Lord's Supper and baptism and other ceremonies. But note again the great importance of confessional unity and how that is absolutely linked to possibility of magisterial protection. If the Reformed in the Netherlands could only stretch enough to qualify as Lutherans, the Catholic government of Philips would have to stop messing with them. I quote again from the same paragraph, "For if we are all united in doctrine, no one would be able to touch us without offending at the same time all of Germany." And adds how this would be so good for them. Clearly, so important was a magisterial partnership for de Bres. And so central was confessional identity in bringing this about, that de Bres was willing to exchange the Belgic confession for a more Lutheran confession. Finally, in conclusion, the Reformed in the Netherlands actively worked to come to a political theological arrangement with the lesser nobles and various political powers that could shield them from the persecution of an increasingly absolute royal court. We have seen indications how this effort may be reflected in the de Bres confession and some of the related writings related to the confession, and how important it was to him. It would seem that it has great potential to help explain de Bres' position on the political restriction of religious liberty, and if it does, the confession would be an obvious place to find such restriction. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for your patience and your kindness, and I don't know if we do have time for questions.
So, Antoine, thank you very much for this very fascinating topic. I think it's not only of historical importance, but could even raise some questions for today. Let's open for maybe 5-10 minutes questions, if there are questions.
I'll throw out a question.
Yeah, Jonathan.
Thank you for it. I was able to catch a lot of it live streaming, so I was following right away. I came in. But the number 8, that's a very fascinating quotation that you gave from the appeal to the magistrates.
Mm-hmm.
How would you interpret this quotation in light of the contemporary debates, Two Kingdom debates?
I was afraid you would ask something like that because the Two Kingdoms debate, I don't follow all of it. I have read Van Drunen and so on. I think they often work, not all of them, but sometimes work with anachronisms. Like, it would be defined as a debate of the relation between church and state. And how people thought in the 16th century and the 15th century was very different. They did not think of the church and the state as two societies. And I think that's basically what you said in your presentation, if I remember correctly. So I'm becoming a beacon. But certainly there's Neville Figgis has written on this, and I don't think many people would dispute that it was differently understood in the 15th and 16th century. So in the 16th century and the 15th century, we think of different churches that were all in one state, right? The state is kind of the canopy that covers us all. Well, it was exactly the reverse in, say, the 15th century. Of course, by the 16th century, things were changing. But people would say, well, we're all Christians. And then you have a few different kings. But the king, or the state, is just the police department of the church. It's not two distinct societies, it's one society. So a lot of the discussion to me is frustrating when I read the kind of anachronisms that are carried into a 16th century debate. So I don't know if that allows me to escape your question.
No, it's interesting how he distinguishes himself from the Galatian
Yeah.
sort of model.
Absolutely, yeah.
Of that. So,
Mm.
often you can conflate sort of the two kingdom distinction with the Galatian distinction, which is, I think, an anachronism. So this is certainly a helpful quotation to say that this is not what they were advocating. Right?
Well, he's explicit. Now the words he uses, terms like material sword and spiritual sword, were commonly used for ancient versions of Galatian theory. And there is kind of a change, if I'm correct, in about the early 14th century. Then it becomes this two swords doctrine, where very much like Pope Boniface, the Pope really has the sword that, he ultimately is the kingmaker, because God gave two swords, one to the civil ruler, one to the Pope, but the Pope is the one who has to sanctify and who has to consecrate the king. Certainly from the time of Charlemagne, is that Charles the Great? Charlemagne? Charles the Great, yeah. So this would be in 9th century. You certainly find this pretension. So you have this whole church-state struggle, to use the anachronism, and a struggle between the king and the church in the 11th and 12th centuries. And the church is pretty much in the ascendancy for a couple of centuries after that. But things are changing by the 15th and 16th century. And de Bres, it seems to me, is playing into this. I mean, he is following the Reformation agenda, the Protestant Reformation agenda. Like the quotes that I read from Article 36, the spirituals, the ecclesiastics, the clerics are to be taxed. Just, they are just to be taxed. And which you won't find this kind of radical appeal almost anywhere a century ago, but here de Bres is doing that. And he explicitly says he does not follow these good doctors, these good teachers. So I think if we picture it kind of as a spectrum, it's always dangerous to draw pictures, but say you have on the extreme left, let's say we have a line at two positions, and we have, say, Menno Simmons on the extreme left, and this would be kind of hands-off, right? Hands-off religion. The state or the civil ruler is not to use the power of the sword in the religious matters. And then you have Constantine, 4th century, and Justinian, both Roman emperors. That would be sword in hand. Sword in hand. Right. Now the question is, where do you put whom? Right. Now I put him at the far left, not to say anything about left and right. You just have to put somebody left and somebody right. But probably Jan van Leyden would be here. Right. He was very much a sword in hand kind of, the kingdom now, a radical transformer. He was a social church revolutionary. And then Menno Simmons, I think, and perhaps Castellio would probably be around here, Castellio. Right? And then now the question is, how about the rest, right? How about, where do you put Luther? Probably closer to this, somewhere here, Luther. John Knox. Who else? Bullinger, perhaps a little Bullinger. Now it's dangerous territory. Where do you put John Calvin? Where do you put Beza? Where do you put Melanchthon? Right? Where do you put Guido de Bres?
But it's interesting in this context, right? De Bres really wanted to distinguish himself from the Anabaptists, right? So he's
Yeah.
to very much distance.
Yeah, and he specifically mentions Menno Simmons. Yeah.
Can you keep going on that list?
Oh.
This is very interesting. I'm surprised that you put Bullinger as
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
Are you sure that's true?
Well, there's a very interesting article by Andries Raad, a South African professor, that shows, at least in the South African context, Bullinger was very influential. Raad argues more than Calvin in some of these early church developments in promoting a high theocratic kind of view of the church. But I'm not an expert on Bullinger. Perhaps that's wrong. I can shift. I mean, I didn't exactly point him, right? I can still put him there.
So where would you put the Bres?
Well, that is the question. I think I would put Calvin around here, right? And I would put the Bres a little left of Calvin. Yeah. But I don't think he's always easy to understand, because there's a development initially. I didn't have time to mention this, but he goes to England. He goes to the Congregation of the Exiled in London, and according to Wim Moon, he could have used Thomas Cranmer's library. He has some reasons for suggesting that, but certainly he was very well informed about that, and he bought into the King Josiah thing. I mean, they had Edward VI, and Edward VI was just the young King Josiah. He was going to reform the whole country. But what happens to de Bres is, after he leaves, he then in 1557 or 1558 only does he go to Lausanne and then to Geneva to study under Calvin and under Beza. And certainly you can see huge Calvinian influences then. So it may be that he had a Lutheran period and then moved. So he started off probably closer to here and then moved as time progressed in that direction. That's possible. Also, one should remember, in the Netherlands in the 1540s, early 1550s, there was no Reformed church. It was kind of more a Lutheran, Reformed. It was very undifferentiated until the late 1540s and then 15. So when he came to faith and became a Protestant, there was no Reformed church then yet. But afterwards, we can discuss perhaps how he developed and how he changed. So yeah, so Calvin there, I would put him, I would put de Bres around there, I guess. But bearing in mind that he may have used, and he certainly has some Lutheran features that we spot. Sorry, yeah, and then
A little bit off topic, but you know how you place one reformer as a major one in each country. In the Netherlands, is always a little tough to do that. But some people would put de Bres as the major reformer in the Netherlands. Would you agree with that, or do you think that's tenable? Or?
yeah, there are not many other candidates. Some people, St. Marnix van St. Aldegonde, he was very important. But just because of the authorship of the Confession, it does give him great importance.
And his major role in all the liturgy.
In the liturgy as well, yeah, I think he didn't really get to preach much in a what we think of as a decent church. So he was, for most of his life, he just preached to little groups of people, anonymously. He was Brother Jerome. They didn't even know his real name.
But
So he dressed.
But we owe a great debt to him, don't we, in the Dutch Reformed liturgy? Didn't really take a bunch of different forms from different countries and bring them together?
I don't know. I haven't encountered that. As far as I know, I don't know if.
Well, I'm thinking of that Peter de Thenis, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, de Thenis,
I think
yeah,
very
okay.
young, because 1545 in Strasbourg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly Datinus was very important as well, very influential.
Both of them mixed up, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, one more question?
I think there was. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I just had a comment. I thought the parallel you made between Cranmer here was spot on, and what it brought to mind was I recently read this fascinating story of Henry VIII sort of establishing moderation. That is, he's the one who sort of makes the decisions. By in 1541, he burned 3 Catholics and three sort of nonconformist reformers, and they were facing one another side by side, and that was the way he sort of established a via media. That was one way. And how, in some ways, this is sort of the inevitable result in some ways of what we're talking about here, is that when you give the ruler a level of moderating authority, it can result in these kinds of actions. And I think it's interesting that one of the products of supposedly of the early modern period is toleration as we know it today. So when we think about sort of earlier notions of toleration, the separation between church and state, and then what comes in 1700, sort of a gradual shift away from this as a reaction to some of these things that we're talking about.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course you have to define religion, because a lot of the intolerance we see in countries today is by a secular state that is also really religious. They just have a different religion. Doesn't have a liturgy like we do. So a lot of was it Kustenberger that wrote a book, the Intolerance of Toleration? So, yeah. So, but thanks. Yeah, that's very perceptive. Yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, Antoine,
Indeed.
thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Thank you.
much again for the topic and for coming and speaking to us.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
Success with finalizing your doctoral work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.